Due Process, winner of 18 regional Emmy Awards, including the 2010 New York Emmy for our coverage of voting rights and the 2010 Mid-Atlantic Emmy for Best Discussion Series.
Professor Ogletree was not only a friend and an enormous supporter when I was in law school, but kept on rooting for me and kept on supporting me through the ups and downs of my career.
Mentor to the president, a star of the Harvard Law School faculty, but still a black man in America. And so he says, a potential target of police profiling. Professor Charles Ogletree in a candid conversation on his new book on race, reform, and his former student. That's next.
There is no concept called the presumption of guilt.
On Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. And by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by the PSCG Foundation and the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation.
We all know about racial profiling, that it's aimed too often at black men, especially the powerless and the poor. But one of the most distinguished professors on the Harvard Law School faculty has come forward to say that racial profiling, by its very nature, is not confined to the most vulnerable, those without resources, status, fame. In his new book, The Presumption of Guilt, The Arrest of Henry Louis Gates, Jr., Race, Class, and Crime in America, Professor Charles Ogletree submits that no African-American man is immune, no matter how safe his place in society would seem to be. I'm Sandra King. Raymond Brown is off. And while in Newark last week for a speech at Rutgers Law School, our old friend sat down with me for a candid, sometimes chilling, conversation.
First, great seeing you again. It's about a concept in law that doesn't exist. There is no concept called the presumption of guilt. It's a presumption of innocence. But people are judged and presumed to be guilty based on their race, their class, what they wear, where they drive, where they shop, where they live. And I want to turn that concept on its head so that we can get away from the presumption of guilt as happened in Professor Gates' arrest.
Well, I think what the whole Skip Gates episode did was reminded us that it is not necessarily your education, your profession, your status in the society, your money, that when it comes down to it, perhaps race is the identifying factor that will either put you on the line or not.
That's exactly right. And we both know Professor Gates. And the reality is, I say in the book, everything he said after showing the police officer his Harvard University ID with his photograph on it and showing him his driver's license with his photograph on it and his address, he said things like, do you know who I am? Do you know who you're messing with? Are you doing this because I'm black and you're a white police officer? He said all those things.
And the officer then used those words to justify the arrest.
And justify that he was being obnoxious, right? Defiant, yes, all those things.
But what would have happened had Skip Gates been a middle-aged, crippled white professor?
You know, it's hard to imagine the same thing would have happened, right? Because he's not a threatening person. He wasn't drinking, he wasn't on drugs, didn't have a weapon. He's in his own house.
And you became lawyer for your friend Skip Gates, and were, I assume, part of what winds up being the famous or infamous beer summit.
I would say the infamous beer summit.
I wonder what you think of the way that your one-time student, who has called you his mentor and advisor, Barack Obama, how you feel about his handling from what many might have thought was a very appropriate response of stupid to the sort of discomforting, let's all sit down have a beer kind of response in order to do damage control?
Well, it's the beer summit was, anti-gender, why is it the guys having the beer? But what did it do? It helped the president get health care, which was the issue in July 2009,
and which
back
could
on the
have
agenda.
Been derailed.
Absolutely, it was derailed. And the president realized, I've got to get this off the calendar, off the agenda, out of the news, and talk about health care for 15 million Americans. And it worked in the sense that it took this off the agenda. When you had two white guys, two black guys in the Rose Garden having a beer, what could be a more kumbaya moment? And you're right, the issue that really made this news is not so much that he said, Gates is my friend. He said the Cambridge police acted stupidly, but he didn't stop there. When you arrest a man in his own house after he gives your identification to show you who he is. So, but people only heard the Cambridge police acted stupidly. And that's why I say in the book that blackened him, which means that whites begin to say, oh, this president is taking the side of his black friend, and his ratings went down very precipitously because of that. And on the other hand, he said, we have a history of racial profiling of blacks and Hispanics. And blacks and Hispanics were saying, wow, our president said we have a problem of racial profiling. It became a way of embracing him. So in both contexts, race became an issue, and that sort of took Gates out of the picture, but it created problems for President Obama then and now when anything dealing with race is brought into the public domain.
So you're not discomforted by his having that kumbaya moment?
I wouldn't have advised it, and I didn't advise it, but my sense is that he's smart enough to know that this moment is designed to get this off of the public agenda. It's not about a beer, it's not about the rest, it's about health care, and he did that.
Before we leave presumption of guilt, the obvious extrapolation from what you talk about, in almost every one of these cases, once the person involved, a person of status, of education, profession, once the person is in the profiled situation, he is able to get out of that situation because of who he is. So then the obvious question becomes, if you don't have status, money, profession, if you are just a black man in America, what is your lot?
It's not very good. And in fact, do not let our status as successful black men cloud the fact that there are many black men without our power. Skip Gates could call me.
Yes.
And most black men find themselves in criminal justice system, can't call me, they can't call anybody, they don't get a lawyer. And so I remind us, don't be comfortable because we can have resources. I mean, Attorney General Eric Holder told his story after the Gates arrest. He remembered being a student at Columbia, driving from New York. The police pulled him over and said, we think you have weapons in your car, and they searched his car. He talked about how degrading and humiliating that was. But he could drive away. He could reflect on it 30 or 40 years later, but for him, it really was a problem.
Another friend of yours, Cornel West, has been on this show to say that going up and down the New Jersey Turnpike, he has been stopped countless times.
Right.
So we're not surprised that that happens, but we know that ultimately that usually ends with an apology or at least a, okay, you can go. What happens to the low status? The
low status gets profiled, gets arrested, gets prosecuted, gets convicted, and in some cases, finally, even when they let them go, they never say, well, we apologize, we made a mistake. And the classic example is my dear friend Johnny Cochran, who was a great lawyer. People know him from representing Michael Jackson and P. Diddy and John Earl Pratt and O.J. But before that, he was a prosecutor. And he tells a story in his book about what I say he made two mistakes. Johnny Cochran bought a Rolls Royce. Fine, up to him. He then drove it on the L.A. freeways. Uh-oh. He gets pulled over by the L.A. police. They pull a gun on him, and his two kids are in the car, and he says, put the guns down, my kids are here. Here's my driver's license, here's my badge, I'm a district attorney. And their response to him, he says, is that, we're sorry, Mr. Cochran, we didn't know it was you.
Exactly.
Well, that's not an answer. If they didn't know it was him, they assumed it was someone else. Does it mean if it's Johnny Cochran's okay to drive on the highway, but not someone else? Because the assumption is that a black man, the presumption, a black man driving a Rolls Royce on the LA highways must have stolen it. That's the system we have to fix.
So let's go another step. If profiling is that profound, then I wonder about another friend, Barry Scheck, who says 10% of the people who are in America's prisons are innocent, and the majority of those are black men. You agree with that?
I not only agree with it, we have data to prove it. I mean, it is shocking to see the number of people who've been wrongfully convicted. And what makes it so tragic, Sandy, they don't spend a month or a year or 3 years in jail. Some spend 20, 25, 30, and some even face the risk of dying in jail for a crime they did not commit. Let me give you an example. Just in this century, the former governor of the state of Illinois did a study of 25 people on death row. And what did he learn? 13 of the 25 people on death row had lawyers, had trials, had juries, were convicted, had appeals, sentenced to death.
But
13 of them were innocent. When I say innocent, they didn't commit the crime.
no, and whatever else you can say about
exactly.
it, he acted on it.
Exactly.
I'm commuting the sentence of all death row inmates, 167 of them.
And Governor Ryan did that. That was wonderful, but it was tragic. This is not the South. This is not in the middle of Jim Crow segregation. This is the 21st century. It's a justice system problem that people are wrongfully convicted.
New Jersey, no more death penalty. Other states either doing away with it or at least thinking about it, because suddenly there's a realization on the part of middle America the system doesn't always work.
But it's too late. Right? I mean, it's too late in some sense, because people should not be convicted. They should not be in the criminal justice system. And if we really want to affect it, we still work on innocence projects. We also have to see what happens to children 0 to 5 who are in poor communities. Are they getting nutrition? Are they getting nurturing? Are they being told they're loved? Are teachers giving them a chance to succeed rather than fail? So it's a wider systemic problem that we need to address.
Causes rather than putting on the Band-Aid.
The Band-Aid is very important because that at least stops some of the tragic pain. But on the other hand, it shouldn't be pain at all if we do some of the things earlier to address it.
I wonder if you think that part of what might be bad law that's coming out of this movement to do away with the death penalty, as in New Jersey, is the idea that you've got to throw something in exchange and that will be life without parole. Cases where people would have had chance to have a life after prison, even in cases of murder. Now those people will face life in prison. Is that good public policy? Is that good law?
I think what you have to do, Sandy, is read my new book, which comes out next year with Austin Surratt and several other authors, published by NYU Press. We have a book on that very topic, that life without the possibility of parole is the new death penalty. Because if you start to see that even though, or you're not going to be executed, you're going to see people who are young, who make a mistake, and who might be reformed, and yet they will die in jail. That's a slower form of death, but it's certain death. On the other hand, the Supreme Court just decided cases saying that young people who commit non-deadly crimes, robbery, theft, crimes of that nature, should not be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. We don't know if a 16-year-old is going to be the same when they're 59, and we can't make that judgment when they're 16.
But the 22-year-old doesn't get covered by that kind of ruling.
And the reality
and
is that...
aren't we concerned
Yes.
that somebody just does something stupid, instead of serving 20 or 30 years, which is real significant time, and maybe becoming someone else? We've seen this happen. We've seen people become worse in prison, but we've also seen people become better. And yet, because there was this need to apologize to the right for doing away with the death penalty, here we are with this life without parole.
It's very dangerous, and I think we as a society need to understand it's not about being tough on crime, it's about being smart on crime. And thinking about what's the best way to have people punished for what they do, but also be productive citizens and give back to the community. Here's the problem. We have millions of people who are coming out of jail. You can't hold them forever. They're coming out of jail. They don't have a driver's license. They don't have a high school diploma. They can't get a loan to go to college. And think about that, what that means. They can't get a job. And so we are not giving them the chance to be productive. I'm not asking for some being soft on crime, being smart on it.
Well, you've been talking about reentry. When I met you 11 years ago at Harvard, you were talking to me about reentry. And it has caught some of the public imagination and some governmental action, and yet it certainly isn't front and center.
It's getting there, and let me give you examples. One of the programs that I have at Harvard, the Charles Hampton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, we have a Pathways Home project. That is, how do we create pathways from prison to home for people?
But jobs are probably the single biggest key to staying out of prison.
Right.
And particularly in this economic and political climate, who's going to want to help the bad guy coming out of prison when there are so many good people who are on the street? What do you do about that?
It's not that. I wish that were the real dichotomy. It's not good guys versus bad guys.
But isn't that how it's seen
That's
by
how,
a good portion
that's how it's projected
of America and its politicians?
And that's what's wrong. This Congress, under President Obama's leadership, passed an over $800 billion stimulus bill to stimulate the economy for jobs. If I were to ask everywhere, I'll do it in Newark tonight. I'll ask, even if they're watching, I'll ask, how many of you know that Congress passed this $800 billion stimulus package to get you jobs? All the hands will go up. I'll then ask, how many of you know how much money, how many billions were given to the state of New Jersey? Hands are silent. Now that tells you something. People don't even know there may be money right in their state, in their neighborhood, in their county that will put people to work. And I'm not talking about rocket science. I'm talking about people who can make cement, who can pave roads, who can build a bridge, who can make the infrastructure different. And President Obama's talked about that. That money is there, and jobs are number one. And folks will work for $6, $7, $8, $9, $10, $11, $12 an hour.
But that failure of the hands to go up leads me to another area that I wanted to talk to you about, and that is how you would grade your former student, Barack Obama.
Longevity says nothing about your character.
Just bad luck, or is it also a failure on the part of the White House to get out the message? Has the message been drowned out?
Ladies and gentlemen, Glenn Beck.
By a lot of screaming on the right, which gets a whole lot more attention.
I think there are three ways I'd grade him. If I grade him on results, I'd give him an A. I'd grade him on effort, I'd give him an A. I'd grade him on communicating results and efforts, that would be a B. Right, and that's not a good grade for this president who is an A student. Why? The difference? Because you think of health care, you think of the stimulus package, you think of what people don't see. He's appointed 2 women. Now there are 3 women in the Supreme Court. That's significant, but no one knows what he's doing that's great for the country. And
well, so that sounds to me like lower than a B.
Well, let me tell you why it's a B. It's the sincerity of it gives him a B, and not a C, not satisfactory. It's more than satisfactory.
But the communication, the ability to communicate.
Let me tell you why it's a problem.
Or is America not willing to listen, and particularly not willing to listen to a black president?
I don't think that's it. I don't think that there is a racial barrier that people not listening to him. I think that he's still in his heart of hearts. He's the same Barack Obama in 2010 that I knew in 1988. He really believes he can bring and should bring all the country together. And I philosophically agree with that. That's not an easy thing to do. He did it at the Harvard Law Review as the first black president. He did it when he gave the dramatic speech in July 2004 to the Democratic National Convention.
That all men are created equal.
Remember he talked about the red states, the blue states? No, it's the United States.
It
won't work. It just won't work.
But the attacks on him,
are
they racial?
You know what? Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. He may not even see them that way. It wouldn't matter to him because he's not someone who's overly sensitive to that. That's not his fear. He talks less about race now in 2010 than he did as a young kid growing up in 1970 when his mother was trying to make him understand the importance of race. From her point of view, a white woman from Kansas trying to say, you know, you like your father. He has a lot to offer, even though Barack Obama only saw his father one time in his lifetime. So I feel it. The country feels it. When he's attacked in ways that people think are insensitive because of race. But the reality is that he's never going to let that bring him down. People in Iowa loved him, even though there's a very small black population in Iowa, and they supported him in the primaries.
But now that he's not the miracle man who can solve all problems immediately, a good number even of those folks have turned.
Yeah, they have, but it's interesting. The people who were most devoted are still most devoted.
Let me move on to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes.
Because that was another area that you found yourself right in the middle of.
Yep.
You were the lead counsel for Anita Hill during the Clarence Thomas hearings. And right now, they're all back in the paper.
Oh, unfortunately.
Ginny Thomas makes a 7:30 a.m. phone call to Anita Hill, leaves a message, a rather odd message, followed by a former girlfriend coming forth after all of these years and saying he was obsessed with pornography, he was obsessed with the women who worked for him. My question to you, firstly, how do you understand that phone call? And second, if that girlfriend had come forward and testified during those hearings, would we have Clarence Thomas on the U.S. Supreme Court?
You know, the call to me is completely inexplicable and mystifying. And when I talked to Professor Hill, when she told me about it, I said, you know, don't call back. This has to be a prank. It can't be Ginny Thomas. How would she call you 19 years after this? And she reported to the Brandeis police, not to the FBI, but the Brandeis police, and then they turned it over. But we just couldn't believe it, but it is true. And it only, in a sense, took off the front page Ginny Thomas's concerns about all the money she's raising, whether her husband was in conflict of interest, and how that should be addressed in some way. The second question is, if Lillian McEwen had come forward, would he be a justice today? I guess I'd have to say, I think he would have. Because you remember the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1991 was all white and all male. And Thomas pulled out a tool out of his kit that would certainly turn the tide. He said, a high-tech lynching of uppity blacks.
I will not provide the rope for my own lynching.
If you think about who was lynched, who had the most brutal cross-examination? Thomas said, I'm not going to talk about these things. Anita Hill said, I must talk about these things.
And you say in All Deliberate Speed, which is an absolutely brilliant book.
Thank you.
5 years, I guess, in now. But really a must-read, I think, for anybody who wants to understand Brown v. Board and your own story, which is so fascinating. You say that there was a lynching. Right. But it wasn't Clarence Thomas.
Exactly, exactly.
It was Anita Hill.
And in fact, the reality is that Anita Hill didn't ask to come forward. She was subpoenaed to come forward, and she did. She told what she knew.
And we're down to about 30 or 40 seconds.
Oh, no, we're just getting started.
I know we are. But when we have these conversations, we usually end with a question of what you would do if there was one thing that you could be in control of, that you could change to make this a more perfect, more equal democracy. When I talked to Judge Carter several years ago, he said, simple, get rid of white supremacy, in his inimitable fashion. I wonder for you, what would it be?
Really quality education from birth, not K through 12, from birth for everybody. Because if we start making sure our children understand the value of education, understanding the challenge that Asia is going to apply, understanding the jobs that are leaving this country, educating our children to be productive leaders in the 21st century is what I think is important.
Does that mean changing the schools as we know them?
Absolutely, in a very dramatic way. Making the school the place where if the child fails, the school is a failure. So education, education, education. It shouldn't be for those who have the resources and the best opportunity. It should be for everyone across the board, so we can be in the 21st century not following a dozen or more countries that are much more successful than we are, but leading the world and being able to share that. Education is the key to success. I know that. Neither of my parents finished high school, but they saw to it that I went on to high school and to college and graduate school. I know my grandparents didn't have any education, but I know that they knew that if they couldn't do it, if they could open the doors for somebody like me, and I can open the door for someone like my children, and my children can open the doors for my grandchildren, then education becomes the one factor that makes all the difference in our lives.
Thank you for educating us. Please come back.
I will. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Well, as you may have gathered from that chat, Professor Ogletree is not only one of the smartest academic lawyers we know, but also one of the most committed. His new book, again, is The Presumption of Guilt, The Arrest of Henry Louis Gates, Jr. and Race, Class, and Crime in America. And his decision to join us on Due Process was just one recent piece of good news for us. If you haven't heard as yet, we are pleased to announce that at the 2010 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards in Philadelphia, we walked away with 3 new Emmys, including Best Discussion Series, bringing our 15-year total to 18. So we hope you'll join us next week and every week for the cutting-edge stories of law and justice that you won't find elsewhere. Till then, for Raymond and all of us here, I'm Sandra King. Thanks for watching.
It turned out that in the space of a few days, I got more than 100 responses. And so the last chapter is now called 100 Ways to Look at a Black Man. And it's amazing, from Justice Thurgood Marshall to John Hope Franklin, to Johnny Cochran, to Vernon Jordan, to Spike Lee, to our Attorney General, Eric Holder. You would be amazed what they had to say. Derek Bell, my professor and professor, I think, David Trouts as well, many others. They each told their story of what happened to them. And it was amazing because it told us that we still have a problem that dates back but is as new today as it was 50 years ago.
Major funding for Due Process provided by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. And by the Fund for New Jersey, supporting informed citizens for an effective democracy. Additional funding provided by the PSCG Foundation and the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation.